Good morning and welcome to the Truth with Bill
and Stig.
And we're going to talk to you today about biblical worldview and some of your Bible questions that you've sent in. We got some good questions in last week, and what we're going to do is get to those later on in the show. Today our show is about poverty, Christianity, and the U.S. government. And Stig, you have a book today it's called The Tragedy of American Compassion by Marvin Olasky. Can you explain a little bit to us?
Exactly. This book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, it's a history book that goes from the 1800s, Bill, right up into the 1900s. We're going to touch just on a few points today because the presentation of the book formally goes about 45 minutes, but we're only going to spend a few minutes. Compassion, of course, means to suffer with. Give you a little bit of an idea of the author, Marvin Olasky. He was an atheist, a Marxist. He was a member of the U.S. Communist Party. He got his PhD from the University of Michigan, and interestingly enough, he became a born-again Christian when he was doing his doctoral dissertation. He's currently, Bill, the editor, and I know you're familiar with this magazine, World Magazine.
Yeah.
It's a Christian publication that talks about world events. I would highly recommend this magazine.
Where can they find that?
You can subscribe to it easily if you want. I'm not sure whether you find these on the newsstands. This one, of course, I've subscribed to. It's pretty easy to get this. I'm sure you can Google it or something like that and get.
Okay.
Or
send us an email at tothetruth@yahoo.com, and we can get that information for you.
Important email address, tothetruth@yahoo.com, because we can send you these reports free of charge.
Right.
So, Bill, I know you've asked before. You asked the question when we were talking about the history component here.
Yeah. My one question is, so how did America's response to poverty become government-centered? And has our government's involvement resulted in the improvement of the poor in America?
Oh, boy, that is phenomenally well stated. Because historically, what you're going to find out when we go through this real quickly, the government, in and of itself, was viewed as having all the money. Who has all the money? The government does. Did Christians have the money? Yes and no. But this book, again, The Tragedy of American Compassion, what it does is it reviews an era in history where Christians, who typically didn't have a lot of money, and other folks too, they gave of themselves, Bill. And what I mean by that is they gave their own labor and a little bit of what treasure they had, but they also gave of the gospel.
Right.
If you were to look at me and you were to say, I'm impoverished, and you were to look at my family and says, we need to help this man, you weren't just looking at the outside, you were also looking at the inside. And it was important for you as a Christian in a society that was Christian at that time, it was important for you to have a view of whether or not I was destitute internally as well as destitute externally. And that's exactly why they gave of the gospel. Really important point here. Let me go on. Poverty, as you know, it's the standard of the world. I believe I'm correct in saying that historically it's been the standard of the world through all of time. Work as an issue, it's almost politically incorrect to say what we're going to discuss a little bit, but work was very important to God. He labored for 6 full days, and he said, he didn't say this is good. He said this is very good, his work.
Very good.
So when you work, it's an honor to the glory of God when work is completed. Doesn't matter what kind of work, that's unimportant. The fact is that when you work, I want to take, Bill, if we have just a minute here, I'm just going to take a few things out of this book report that we did. As a bit of trivia, you'll like this.
Okay.
The number one issue that was the number one contributing factor to poverty in the 1800s, because this is one of the history books we're dealing with here, was drugs and alcohol. That was one of the number one contributing factors.
Now, do you find that being the problem today as well?
I believe that it's a large part. I don't have the statistics on that, but I believe that drugs and alcohol are a huge contributing factor to this issue of poverty and impoverished families today.
Right.
Let me talk to you a little bit about that portion that I said would be a little politically incorrect. There was a pastor named in Buffalo, New York, named S. Humphrey Girton. He actually went out there and he said, you know what? We're going to view the impoverished, people that are poor, and we're going to say, these are the worthy poor and these are the unworthy poor. Now, politically today, if you were to say that, people say, oh my gosh, well, how do you say people are worthy? in their poverty and people are unworthy. Well, what he did is he had people chop wood. And Pastor Gert took the wood and he sold the wood. And of course, he took the money and he gave the money to the individual and or his family. And what happened is you'll love this.
Right.
What happened is that when the applications for this program were handed out, they fell from 160 applications to 49 when people found that they actually had to chop the wood.
So you had 111 people that didn't want to work,
Yes, sir.
but they still wanted the benefits?
Historical fact. They
Okay.
wanted benefits, but they weren't willing to work for them. And remember, we said God worked, and it's important to God that we work. Few of the points as we jump forward. That was in the 1870s. By the 1890s, social universalists had come in, really the intellectually elite, and they said, you know what, Bill, work has nothing to do with this.
Right.
Society as a whole is really the problem. You're not the problem individually, it's society. So they said, you know what, we need to take care of you. If society is the problem, if we're the problem and you're not the problem,
Right.
even though you're the poor, we need to take care of you. And at that point, things started to transition seriously from a position of, why don't you show that you're willing to work so that we can give you a hand up, not a hand out.
Hand out, right.
It started to transition in history. I'm sorry.
Oh, when did welfare actually come into? Was that something that they had back in the 1800s, or is that something that came in later on?
It came in later on, and we're not going to touch on it a lot today, folks, but it was a
Right.
period, it was a transitional period where it grew and grew and grew. You're going to be shocked, Bill, when we end.
And that was something to give, like you say, people a hand up, not a handout. To get
From
them,
a Christian perspective, it was
get them
all
on there.
about the gospel so that they could look at the inner man and the outer man, obviously the family, and say, what can we do to help?
What-
So, I'm
well,
sorry.
I was going
again.
to say, what are some of the biblical aspects as far as, I've got some scripture here that talk about, because I think Jesus had talked a lot about the poor in the scriptures. I think those are some of the
No
biggest
question, yeah.
verses. I mean, you can find just hundreds and hundreds of verses in the Bible that talk about. Can I just give you a few of those right
please,
here?
yeah.
Deuteronomy 15:7. It says, if there is a poor man among you, one of your brothers, in any of the towns of the land which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand to your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him and generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. And as you see, it's sufficient for his need. And I think that sometimes we find that in America here, especially, because I have been over to other countries, America here is just blessed. I mean,
Without a doubt.
when you look at some of the poor here in America, those are actually some of the richest people compared to other countries. I mean,
question.
just no question about that at all. Another great verse you can find in Deuteronomy 26:12, which is in the Old Testament. It says, when you have finished paying the complete tithe of your increase in the third year of tithing, then you shall give it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, and the widow, that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. And I think, Christ is telling us in a lot of passages in the Bible that, we are so blessed that we need to look at our brother's needs and find that, if we have that extra shirt to give them, if we have that extra meal. People always talk to me about, well, there's so many people on the streets these days. Almost every corner I go to, there's somebody holding a sign. How do we know who to feed and who not to feed?
You really don't know. I mean, you really don't know who to feed and who not to feed. My suggestion would be that you get with a church organization, a small group,
Right.
another organization out there that's had some history and background in this, so that you, as a group of individuals, can go out there and assess what the needs are, and then say, not only how do we address the need, but how do we take that person from the position that they're in now and enable them
To lift them up.
Yes, sir.
Right, exactly. That's the main thing, I think, is to take that person who's in need and not just keep giving them money, but to give them money and give them education and also a way to improve themselves where they're not onto a program that's run by the government.
Exactly. We're going to talk why in just a second, but you just gave me a great segue.
Oh, okay.
Listen to this quick bullet, folks.
Okay.
In 1937, 2/3 of the states, this is in America, had provisions requiring that before relief could be given, relatives with sufficient ability. This is 1937. Relatives with sufficient ability were to be called upon to support poor persons and this is a key, were subject to prosecution if they refused. That means, Bill, that if something happens to you and your family, and it's 1937, 2/3 of all the states said, hey, Stig, you're my brother. It's my job to come in and to help you because we're family.
Right.
The government actually recognized that in 2/3 of the state.
Right.
So you got to say, well, what in the world happened? An interesting point.
Okay.
By 1970, the Supreme Court had ruled welfare had become so institutionalized, the giving strictly of money with no strings attached had become so institutionalized that the Supreme Court ruled in 1970 that recipients had a constitutional right, this is recipients of welfare,
Right.
had a constitutional right to court-like hearings before benefits could be terminated.
Wow. Oh, wow.
So, folks, I mean, I skipped through 45 minutes quickly, but I want to just do one last item here, Bill. I want to talk just for a moment about what has happened when we went from this giving of ourselves and the gospel to government giving. And these are facts, folks. I think you're going to be shocked, Bill. You may have heard this, maybe you haven't. 1964, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, said, hey, we have money as America, just like you said, right?
Right.
We have more money than anyone else in the world. We can get rid of poverty. There won't be one poor person in all of America. 1964. Well, what happened was in 64, the budget for the Housing, Education, and Welfare Department was $2 billion. 15 years later, that same budget was $180 billion. 15 years. What happened? We went from $2 billion in 64 when we said we're going to have a war on poverty to $180 billion. Well, what interestingly, that $180 billion was 1.5 times the spending of all the military forces in America combined. It was the third largest budget in the world, Bill. Our housing, education, and welfare in 79. Wow. It was behind the federal government in America, the former USSR, and here at number 3 was this housing, education, and welfare. Not only that, they had created 100 new welfare agencies that had institutionalized addressing welfare across America. Last couple of points.
Right.
Food stamps. This is going to shock you. 1965, when we were in the midst of this war on poverty, 500,000 beneficiaries of food stamps. 1990, 25 years later, the number was 22 million.
Wow.
And then, Bill, here we are in 2011. We're discussing this issue of how do we get out of poverty. The recipients for food stamps are 43 million people.
In America?
In America. The highest of that is right there in the backyard of our politicians in Washington, D.C., with over 22%, right in the backyard of those we've elected to address issues like this.
Well, I think that leads us to a lot of the things where Christ, he saw the needs of the people out there when he fed like the 5,000 when they were out there in the desert. But he also, I believe, taught us to be fishers of men. He also taught us to fish. He also taught us to go out and to be responsible. I think one of the things, I believe most of the poverty in America is fostered by the misconception that it's our government's responsibility to provide the needs for the poor. And I think, this system has gained momentum, through the political process of the promise of like liberal politicians to champion the cause of the poor. It's said to say that we have third and fourth generations today who think it's normal for people just to
Bill, you're dead on.
Yeah,
you're absolutely dead on, and it's one of the conclusions that you walk away from, folks. Historically, where were we, and where are we today? It is without question that the government today, and the government has for decades, been a government that looks at the issue of poor and says, okay, not only do we maintain the poverty level and condone it, but the government is actually involved in a process where poverty is a growth industry in America.
Right.
And it's incredible that we are creating more poverty. We're not alleviating it. It's exactly what you said, and how we kind of step back as two Christian guys and we say, well, what do you do? It's almost overwhelming.
Right.
What do you do as an individual and as a church as a community, what do you do to address these issues?
Yeah. Well, you know, Paul said to the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians 3:10 that for even when we were with you, this we command you, that if you do not work, you do not eat. And I think a lot of times today people think that, well, you know, I can find a job, but I can only make $8 an hour, and I'm worth way more than $8 an hour, you know. And so if they didn't have all these government programs that they could go to, the only other choice would be to work. And I think that's where we need to get rid of a lot of these programs for the people who are able to work, and put that money into jobs that can, you know, bring people into work. But that's another story, you know, and
It's complicated, folks. I mean,
it very is,
very
because
complicated.
there's a lot of people out there who have been working all their life, you know, 30, 40 years, and all of a sudden their company folds, and here they are and they're unemployed. Well, what do you do? Now, those are the people that really need a helping hand, you know. And like you said earlier in the show, that drugs and alcohol were a problem back in the 1800s. Well, what do you do to a person, say, who's been an alcoholic for the last 10 years, and they keep throwing their money away, and they keep throwing their money away, and you keep helping them, and they keep throwing their money away, and you keep helping them, you keep throwing their money away? You know, where does it stop? Where does it stop? You know, that's another program, I guess, that we could go into in
it's
that
the
one.
harsh reality, folks, of the environment that we're in, of what's happened.
Right. Who to help and not to help. And I think what we have to do is go by what you said earlier, that we need to help everybody that's out there, but you also need to be very wise in the decision of where you put your money. So if you get into like an organization that, like a church or a school or something, that goes out maybe to a park and cooks dinner for the poor and things like that, you know, trying to help in that way.
With the gospel.
With the gospel.
And with an overview that when you look at the poor, you say, why are you poor?
Right.
Maybe not that bluntly initially, but
Right.
the basis is that we need to say, why are you poor? What are the contributing factors? Is there anything that we can do to give you a hand up, so that in a country like America, that you can partake of what
Right.
this country has to offer? And candidly, it comes through work. It
Yeah.
comes through work programs, so we need to create that,
Right.
not have this entity that we look at over here and say, my gosh, it's the government. They have all of this money. We need to grab some of it. That doesn't do anything. It maintains and condones. It does not lift up. So the biblical worldview that you have, it needs to be a comprehensive view of poverty, Bill, just like you said.
Well, I think, you know, you were saying in your book too, you had mentioned that from between 1965 to 1968, it rose from 200,000 families being on welfare to over 800,000 families.
Yeah, it's horrendous. So, Bill, I guess as the show comes to an end, the real question that we need to ask, and this one we're going to pose to our viewers, is, so where do you think that you can fit in addressing the needs of those around you who are poor or really need your help? Think about it a little bit, folks. Appreciate your viewership today.
All right, so as we always say, make sure that you spend time in the Word, spend time with family, and thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you.